Welcome back to the Freedom Seminar, everyone. My name is Dale Matchik. I'm the chair of the Econ program here at Northwood University. This afternoon, we are going to have a panel on education and freedom in the United States. And we have three panelists, each of them associated with Northwood University. First of all, to my immediate left, we have Professor Glenn Moots. Glenn Moots has a lot of personal experience with education. He has more degrees than anybody else I know, and I won't tell you where they're all from, but I think his PhD is from Louisiana State in political science, his latest. And he also has a master's in economics, and so he's a Renaissance man. He's also a highly regarded teacher here, where he has won the Senior Class Excellence Award and also the Maratha Faculty Ethics Award. And he teaches ethics here, as many of you know, primarily. To his left is Andrew Reeder, who is on his way to becoming a distinguished professor of something somewhere, I believe. At this point, he is early in his education, but he's already distinguished himself by having an article published on the subject of homeschooling. His research, which he put into an essay, was published by the Foundation for Economic Education in their journal Ideas on Liberty. And so I thought he was a good candidate for this panel, also having personal experience with homeschooling. Finally, we have at the end of the table Cliff Harris. Cliff Harris also has a lot of experience with education. He has taught at different institutions, including in the public schools in Saginaw, at charter schools in Detroit, at the name of the school, Cliff? Cornerstone Schools in Detroit. And finally, at the college level here, as those of you who were here on Friday know, he was one of the first people to receive a master's degree in economics from Walsh College. And he also has quite a bit of experience in the business world, in the mortgage and insurance industry that he brings to his classroom. Like Mr. Moots, he is a recipient of the Maratha Faculty Ethics Award and the Senior Class Ethics Award for his teaching here at Northwood University. So the plan is for each one of these folks to come and speak to you on the topic of education with an opening statement. And then after we've been through all three panelists, you have an opportunity to ask questions. And we'll start with Dr. Moots. Thank you, Glenn.
Thanks, Dale, for having me, and I admire all of you for your fortitude here on day 3 of listening to other people talk. So I'll hopefully deliver something you'll be able to absorb, and we'll have some questions and conversation afterward. As you know, education, like so much of life, is not a one-size-all proposition. As former students might predict, I'm going to be Aristotelian about this, and I'm going to start with the end, and I'm going to begin with some definitional questions. And I'm not going to answer these right now, but if you're paying attention, I will answer them to some degree as we go. The first question is, of course, what is education, and what distinguishes it from other activities? It's a good question. Second question, to what end or to what goal are we educating? Who should be educated? Who should be doing the educating? And what resources are available? Make sure I keep track of my own time, since I threaten the panelists with that too. Now, rather than, again, try to answer these right now, I'll answer them as we go implicitly. But I will say that the answers to these questions have changed significantly over the years. Now the world is, comparatively speaking, very wealthy. And before this wealth, most people were not formally educated at all, at least not in the way that we think of formal education, with a structured curriculum, titles, credentials, and things like that. But with the beginning of of leisure and, of course, the spread of an educational culture in the Protestant Reformation. Leaning on the Middle Ages, education began to expand significantly. And the high watermark in America for education, as far as I'm concerned, is early America, in which we had basically 100% literacy. You can look it up if you don't believe me. And we had a vibrant culture of newspapers and pamphlets and an appreciation for both popular and high culture. And even into the 1950s, Latin was sustained in our public schools, as well as poetry, memorization and oratory and things like that. And of course, to this, people say, well, what about STEM? And my answer to that is that the SR-71 Blackbird, if you know anything about aircraft, you know that that's basically an unmatched aircraft in terms of capabilities, was built by people with slide rules. So I think, even this idea that we've advanced in terms of education there is overstated. To me, the low point for education begins with post-war America. In higher education, the beginning of that was the GI Bill and the Great Society, which supercharged credentialism and this kind of fake meritocracy that we associate with credentials. I'm not convinced that we're generating too many educated people. Most people think of education now as job training, and we can maybe talk about that in Q&A. I'm also going to leave aside higher education, though I've just alluded to it, and if we want to talk about that more in Q&A, we can. K-12, which is really our main subject, has become kind of a playground for ideologues and rent-seeking administrators and teachers' unions who I'm going to presume have bullied kids for at least the last 2 years and many more before that. I think just because they could. And, there's an expression, a face can launch 1,000 ships. I'm hoping that a masked face launches 1,000 class action lawsuits for developmental disabilities, emotional and psychological damages, and educational loss. But my point is not COVID policy. I think that the big move with COVID was really going remote, because parents got a window into the classroom, and they discovered not only how ideological and indoctrinating it is, but I think they also began to see some of the reasons why it's been largely ineffective. And so now we're seeing what's going on in education affecting not only what happens at school board meetings. You don't have to go far to see the tape, as they used to say on that, but also this is now trickling up to statewide elections, as we saw in Virginia. And I'm going to go on record as saying I think we'll see a 40-seat move in the House between the two parties, which is not something that you would expect, even in a midterm election. I think that what's happening in schools is even going to affect the national elections. So Americans seem to care more about K-12 education than ever, and that point seems to be driven largely by parental rights. So what do we do now? Well, I think that all the pernicious elements of education of the last half century are owed to two things. One is centralization, and one is bureaucratizing, and that includes regulation and subsidies, and that extends, of course, to higher education. And we have a solution to that. And since you're at Northwood, you know what the solution is. It's called the market. And so I want to touch on some things in broad strokes that I think would make a difference. And the first is to decentralize and deregulate. However quickly or gradually we can do that, I think the more we decentralize and deregulate, the better off we are. That means moving away from regulations and bureaucracies, especially those that are de facto federal. And this includes accreditation, which, as far as I'm concerned, is no guarantee of quality. The second is to defund and privatize. So defund and privatize. And I would begin with a voucher system that's used by parents, and the state of Michigan is already flirting with this on a small scale for all parents. And I'm hoping this expands, begin with a voucher system that can be used by parents with only the barest regulation, and moving eventually to only means-tested relief at best, which is the only rational route, I think, for tax dollars if we're going to continue to rely on tax revenue, which I suspect we probably will, at least in the short term. And the goal should really be to have no free anything from college down to pre-K. Pre-K, by the way, being increasingly shown to be ineffective as an academic anything. That would be the ideal, and again, it may take a while to get there, and we'll probably have some means testing along the way, which basically means we'll have aid for people who need financial help. And then third would be to decredential education, which begins with privatizing and taking away union monopolies, which will have the effect of introducing entrepreneurship. So the solutions here, those are things that we would do to sort of eliminate some of the problems. The first thing I would say is we need to give people skin in the game. So self-selection is one of the great hacks of life, if you haven't figured that out. Go where people are self-selecting in, and your life will be a lot better. Where people are sort of coerced in, you find a whole different climate and environment. And what happens with a lot of educational decisions is that people are on autopilot. They're not really self-selecting. And somebody says, well, I live in City A, so my kids are going to go to City A public schools, and those schools will exist regardless of what I do. And so what we need is to give people skin in the game, in other words, enable them to self-select as much as possible. The second would be parental control. And, of course, kids will slip through the cracks, but they're going to slip through the cracks in any system. So the idea here is you decentralize accountability and responsibility, and it only makes sense to use the people who have the most emotional and financial, or the most direct emotional and financial relationship to the students. I know somebody might say to this, but we can't trust the parents, and my answer to that is, well, who educated the parents? So if you don't trust the parents to make decisions for their kids, and they, by and large, were under, the mentoring or the tutelage of the current system, then that's just another indictment of the system. So the third is individualization. We start taking people seriously as individuals, determining both the length and type of education accordingly, and I don't need to labor that here at Northwood. Maybe I would somewhere else, but I don't have to labor the idea of us being individuals here. And then, obviously, the last is innovation and entrepreneurship. Those who take ethics with me, for years we read Plato's Republic. We're back to doing that, and Plato warns against innovation because it can breed chaos and disorder. And my answer to that is that the chaos and disorder is already here. Now, maybe it's in the classrooms, but I think it's basically in the hearts and minds of the students. And I think that parents perceive that, and I think that's why they're so upset about the status quo. And so to break up the system now, as far as I'm concerned, is really to lose almost nothing. It's kind of like breaking up a gallstone. It's become painful. It's become a kind of obstruction to creativity and entrepreneurship. So I think we have very little to lose and everything to gain. And then the last positive step would be philanthropy. Insofar as we can move from a system of taxation to a system of philanthropy, I think we're better off. So my prediction is that K-12 will fall into four main areas of interest. The first is traditional education. And I love the idea of traditional education. And this is the education of the whole person. And the education of the whole person is obviously for both personal as well as professional goals. People sometimes distinguish those two, and that's really a false dichotomy. The traditional education is an ideal education, but as we're learning, many people don't want it, and we may not have the resources for it. So that then enables us to have a second focus, which may in some cases be a separate focus, and that's professional education. And what I'm thinking of there is mentoring and training primarily toward white-collar careers or entrepreneurship. My own kids started businesses when they were in high school. Thanks, by the way, to John Gustinchik. And, that sort of thing, a lot of people have that desire, and they should be encouraged in that direction instead of being locked inside of a school building from 7:30 until 5 o'clock or whatever. And then the third would obviously be trades. Trades, those people have a tremendous intelligence for what they do. I think that we just don't pay it nearly enough respect. And increasingly I hear about systems that are sort of phasing out trades. I don't understand this at all. It doesn't make any sense. And if you guys are homeowners and you need people to do trades work on your house, you'll find out pretty fast that you wish there was more education in the trades. And then the fourth is obviously some combination of 1 through 3. And so what is the vanguard of the future? I'll tell you, I think the vanguard, is already here. The first is homeschooling, which obviously enables the greatest flexibility. And what's happened over time is that the technology has enabled homeschooling to become easier for parents. And also as parents are working from home, homeschooling becomes a lot easier too. So I think that's going to take on more influence, and it already has. And we homeschooled our kids, although the world was a different place when we started that. The second is parochial schools, which are incredibly more efficient dollar for dollar than public education is. That's been here a long time, obviously. The third is something you may not have heard of. It's called classical education, and that's basically K-12 education that's focused on a more traditional curriculum going back to the Greeks and Romans and great books and things like that. Those schools have been popping up everywhere for about the last 20 years, and if you don't know anything about them, it's worth a look online. And then the fourth is charter schools. What's interesting about charter schools is that it kind of leaks into my fifth point. And the fifth point is I think we're going to see colleges reaching down more into the K-12 space and K-12 schools reaching up into the college space. So, for example, Hillsdale is founding, 50 charter schools in Tennessee. They raised $200 million in 2020, and they're going to get into the K-12 space in a very significant way. There's also something called the St. Constantine School down in Texas, which actually started as a K-12 plus college program. So I think we're going to see more sort of reaching down, reaching up. And, of course, part of that is dual enrollment, which is increasingly playing a role in the grades 9 through 12 space. And I'll end with this. I don't know if you've heard of Hiroshi Onoda. Has anybody heard of him? He was a Japanese soldier who refused to acknowledge that the war was over in 1945. He didn't surrender until 1974. The emperor sent his former commanding officer there to ask him to surrender. So he held out almost 30 years. And I think our own system has been failing for at least 30 years. And I'm hoping that it's time to surrender and enable peace. Peace for our students, peace for our parents, and peace for our taxpayers. Thanks very much.
All right. Can I be heard on the video? Do I need to adjust this or anything? Okay. All right. Thank you for being here. I'm Andrew Reeder, and I know it's been a long seminar, so I'll try to make my remarks a bit brief. But over the course of the seminar, I've noticed that a key theme has been the importance of entrepreneurs in our society. And I believe that entrepreneurs possess that one greatest resource that Stephen Moore told us about on Thursday night. Any students here remember what that was? The human mind. Now, I know every human that I've ever met has had a human mind, but someone like a 3-year-old is not likely to be an entrepreneur. Okay? So I try to think about the development of the human mind, and the key input into the human mind is obviously education. Now, I think that we need to think about what we mean when we say education. Because when I say education, given my background, I probably have a very different picture in my mind than any of you think of, or maybe not any of you, but many people think of when they have the word education in their mind. And I think that the common norm is to think of sitting in a classroom and you're lined up and you're focusing on your lecturer And you're trying to absorb information that you know will show up one day on black and white on an exam. And that's very important education, but it's not, I believe that it's just one piece of education in an umbrella term that we call education. Okay? So studies have shown that students that have done the best in terms of the best, I mean they have achieved greater things both in higher education beyond K-12 and in their personal and professional lives, have learned beyond what they have learned in the classroom. So they have learned in the classroom, but then when they leave the classroom, they spend time in the public library, they spend time with their parents, their grandparents, their next door neighbor, whoever a mentor would be. And that is what develops their individual nature. And that brings me to my first point, which is a state-regulated curriculum cannot be relied upon to develop individuals. It can be a valid option for some students to get a basic education, but it cannot be the founding system that raises students into college students and professionals. And so I really think that we could sum up the Northwood idea in this and say that government regulation, central planning almost always fails because we're individuals. And so in that case, I say that a centrally planned curriculum that is supposed to apply to all students everywhere is really going to cater towards what is thought of as the average student. But how many of you would think of yourselves as an average student? And you don't have to raise your hands. You can say, maybe I think of myself as ahead, maybe I think of myself as behind. And I feel like we've set this standard that says, if you don't meet the criteria to do well in our state-mandated curriculum, then you're behind. And if you exceed our expectations, you're ahead. And in that case, I think we kind of class students into those that are, for lack of a better term, dumb, and those that are smart. But I don't believe that students that are considered dumb are actually, I believe that they have other ways of learning. Okay, and there's nobody that could disagree with me about this. If there's studies about this everywhere, everybody learns differently. Okay? Some people can't learn as well in a classroom, and they weren't really cut out to learn as well as a classroom. Some people can learn really well in a classroom, and those are the students that you're going to see progressing in a traditional educational atmosphere. And so I'd like to cite a study, and I don't want to misquote it, so I'm going to go to, and this appeared in a Wall Street Journal article by one of my favorite commentators on education, Kerry McDonald, and it's really a response to the Mo Willems book, The Pigeon Has To Go to School. Anybody read that when they were a kid? Okay, well, Mo Willems wrote Don't Let the Pigeon Drive the Bus. Anybody read that? Okay, well, it's supposed to be a very popular children's book back when I was a kid. Now, the pigeon has to go to school essentially has the pigeon at the age where he's supposed to go to school, but he doesn't want to, and the whole book is forcing him into that. And the article that I'm trying to find in my notes cited a study that shows one basic age to enter education has failed students. Essentially, I believe it says 69% of students who were born in late summer months, be that July or August, and have to enter school at the same time as people who were born in early winter months, such as October and November. The children that were born in early winter months are much older than the children who were born in late summer months. Because when you're at the age of 5 or 6, or maybe it's even 4 now, 10 months can mean a lot for you. You are not as mature as some of the other students that were born technically in your same grade. And I think that's funny because while I was growing up homeschooled, a lot of people would ask me what grade I'm in. And that didn't make a lot of sense to me because I thought, don't you want to know what age I am? No, they wanted to know what grade I'm in. And so it's like we reduce children down to a grade rather than an age, rather than a maturity level. You want to know what their grade is. So you're not born into a time, you're born into a grade. And then the students who are not ready, 69% of them that were born in the summer are more likely to be diagnosed with such increasingly common psychological, I'm not going to say illnesses, psychological conditions such as ADHD and such as I'd have to find the study, but you know what I mean. Educators try to almost accommodate for this system by taking the children that don't do well and labeling them. But in my view, the thing that is wrong with this is the children are not doing well because they're not cut out for this system. Individuals are not cut out for a system. The very term system is really to what? When you think of a system, it's to crank out a certain product. That's what I think of when I think of a system, a production line. Individuals do not fit into any system. We don't fit into ideological systems, religious systems, political systems. We're individuals, and that's what makes America great. We are diverse people. Every family, and I mean every family, every person, no two people are going to agree on everything. And every family is going to have values that differ from other families. And these families, when they raise their children, are going to want their children to at least have some respect for the values of their parents. You know, nobody wants to force their children to believe something, but they want to have that individual characteristics kind of passed down to their child. And the children are individuals, and the parents are individuals, but when you put students together in the groups of their families, rather just in groups of their peers, they have a lot more in common because their parents have been with them since they were born, most of the time. And they know a lot more about what makes them who they are. So I think that there's a lot of backlash against parents these days. And I think that parents have acted out in ways that have not always been responsible. But when a parent thinks that they're protecting their child, they'll do things like surround school board offices, like we have seen in the news. And I don't think that the response that we're getting from administrators and from our Attorney General calling parents domestic terrorists has been a particularly good help to this situation either. I think that you're never going to be able to get parents together and make them feel good about what to teach in a curriculum. Are we going to teach creationism or are we going to teach evolutionism? Now, if you look at me in particular, I'm not necessarily a young earther, but I do believe in creationism, so I kind of don't fit into either of those categories. You have infinite range of things that parents will constantly bicker about. And it's kind of like, let's say the government mandated that only one restaurant would be in your city. There would be so much bickering about what should that restaurant serve. I don't like Chinese food. I like Mexican food. Okay, especially when you think about the cultures of various people. People with a Mexican culture or a Chinese culture or a European culture are all going to want that restaurant to have different foods. But we have a very obvious solution to this problem. We don't have one restaurant in every town. Okay, we have a Polish restaurant out in Bay City that I eat at a lot because I'm Polish. And we have a Chinese restaurant that I still eat a lot because I like Chinese. And honestly, I eat at all the restaurants because I like to eat. But the point is if you had more options in education, more charter schools, more parochial schools, and more ability to homeschool, unschool, and really when you talk about homeschooling and unschooling, there's a lot of discrepancy about what the difference is. But homeschooling, unschooling, and microschooling, which is increasingly becoming rampant, these are all valid options, or rather valid alternatives to what we have now. And when you have alternatives, there's no more bickering, there's no more political distress, because I'm not gonna care what the school down the road is teaching, because my kids are going to this school that's teaching what I decided would help my children grow more. And you think about this in terms of higher education. We have several options for higher education. Some cities have several options within the city for higher education. And I'd like to classify trade school as higher education as well. It's education beyond K-12. And so there's even choices of whether or not you're going to go to college or whether or not you're going to go to trade school based on what you're skilled at. People would think you're crazy if you'd say, I am terrible at math, I hate math, but I'm a math major because somebody told me that I should be a math major. No, you should be a science major if you're good at science. Okay? There's options in higher education that are not in the pivotal roots of education, which is K-12. We need to have those same kind of options for K-12 in terms of curriculum changes and even instructing changes that children and their parents can choose between to raise them into the entrepreneurs and individuals that we need to run our society. And that kind of brings me down to the third point, which is there's a lot of fear about I'm not going to say fear, but a lot of worry about non-traditional education. And I was homeschooled, and so homeschooling is very different from traditional education. We don't necessarily have a rigorous school year. We don't necessarily have a limit on when we are going to learn this and when we are going to learn that. But what we do in homeschooling is we say, okay, you need to learn what you need to know to move on with your next step in life. And we're going to figure out how we can learn that together. And that helps a lot of students as a valid option for education. And things like non-traditional education also give out a lot more mobility to families. I remember when I was studying U.S. government in high school, I was like, gee, it would be really cool to see that picture in my textbook, the White House. And my mom was like, okay, let's do it. So we emailed our congressman, and we went off to the White House. And that was an amazing experience that I'm never going to forget. And it excited me about learning U.S. government, even though it was not something that I would have been excited about otherwise. And things like that would not necessarily always be as possible in more structured traditional education. So I'll kind of close on a little personal story. My mother was once approached by someone we know, and she said, and the person said to her, how are you going to teach all those kids? How are you going to teach all those kids? She has 6 kids, and she's still teaching 5 of them, and she's doing a great job. And my mother just kind of looked at her, and she was like, why would I want someone else to teach my children when they have to worry about 29 other children in the classroom? They have to teach 30 kids in each of their classes. And no, I'm not here to bash public school, because I think it's a good option for many students. But there's this idea that parents do not have the ability to raise their children, to educate their children, when in reality, like, what qualifies the person in the public school with 30 other children to do it any better than the parent who's been with you since you were a child? So that's my personal story on homeschooling. I'm more of a question and answer guy, so I'm going to close up a little quickly and try and get into that. We can talk about this a lot more in the question session, and I'm happy to take any comments or pushback you have. So thank you.
Public education, K through 12, versus charter education, K through 12. Based on my own personal experiences, after leaving the insurance business, there was a call to have men come into the public school and teach. Well, I think it was more of an experiment, because once we got there, we found out that it wasn't that we were really, really welcomed. Now, many school districts have had issues when it comes down to them being in the red. In the state of Michigan, we decided that we would use the lottery to fund schools, okay? But think of the number of school districts that are broke. Should that be the case? Well, part of it is when you look at administrators and you look at school psychologists and school social workers, what happens is there are a number of students that are classified, and they're classified with various disabilities. There's the ADHD, there is EI, and there is also BAD. And so the problem, when you look at it, is the fact that teachers basically are having their classrooms jam-packed. We're talking most teachers 35-1. Makes it very, very difficult versus a charter school. Having taught in a charter school, the ratio was probably about 12-1. Makes it much more manageable. Now, something else that would happen in the public schools, you'd have teachers that would basically be in the teachers' lounges, and they would literally be talking about students. And how can you be helping someone if you're bashing them? Okay? I never saw that in a charter school. The other thing is there are a number of special education teachers. Most of those teachers are paid a lot more money compared to other teachers. We talk about math all the time and how students have difficulty dealing with math. Well, math is a building block. And basically what happens is usually between fractions, decimals, and algebra, that's usually where students tend to have problems. What I found in the public school districts were the fact that you had people that were teaching mathematics that were not qualified to teach math. Okay, so why do students shy away from math? Because somewhere along the lines, their math foundation isn't as strong as it should be. Now, having taught in the charter school, I found some interesting things. Students were learning Mandarin. Students basically would do field trips. They'd have partnerships on one Friday out of the month. They'd have a partnership come in. Students basically interned, and we're talking K through 12, which gives them an idea of what they might want to do when they decide to go on to higher education. Now, in our book, When We Are Free, we find that Marva Collins created her own school. And why did she do that? She did that because she looked at the public school and she saw that the public school was not adequate enough to take care of all the needs. I think Andrew kind of pointed it out best when he said, one shape does not fit all. The other thing was, Marva, rather than using these new and improved situations, she went back to the old classics. She had her students reading Shakespeare. And the funny thing is, I identify with Marva Collins because I don't necessarily believe that just because something is new and improved, I'm more along the lines of, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Now, some other things when it came down to public school. Yes, the most important day of the year is count day. And they do everything that they can to get students to come to school on that particular day, even if it means offering all the students free pizza. Okay? Now, should you necessarily have to negotiate to get students to come to school? You shouldn't have to. But when we take and we look at that, that says something. So if they're only negotiating with them on count day, what happens the rest of the year? Do they really care whether or not those students are there? Probably not. Now, getting back to the lottery, most people don't know what the lottery used to represent. The lottery used to represent that once a year, someone in the community would be sacrificed, and they stoned them to death. So naturally, you didn't want to get the short straw or hit the lottery. We kind of see the same thing happening with lottery winners, don't we? Don't they end up usually broke? So now, if there's all this money out there and we've got school districts that are broke, why is that? How's that money really, really being spent? When I look at charter schools, I say that the money is being spent correctly because it's addressing the needs of the students. Cornerstone School in Detroit that I taught at, it was an academy for business. And so all the students that went there were generally thinking about being in business. And the funny thing is we had a 90 to 95% graduation rate with those students going on to graduate from college. When I look at the public school, that number's nowhere near that. Okay? And so the question becomes, do we continue to fund public education, or do we look for alternative means of educating people? You be the judge. Thank you.
All right, that's what I love about panel discussions. We got three very different perspectives on this particular issue, and I appreciated every one of them. So now is your opportunity to ask questions. If you're online, you can post your questions in the place provided on the screen there, and I'll be monitoring those as well. I'll be calling on people from the audience to ask their questions as well. However, could I get this started by asking a question about a topic which I did not hear from any of the speakers, and that was the idea of a public education providing a standard of equality of opportunity or something along those lines in a society like ours, which is meant to be a meritocracy. It's only going to be honored if people consider that system to be fair. So one of the arguments I've heard for a one-size-fits-all approach to education is that if we're all getting the same education, that really gives a chance for meritocracy to be legitimate. Whereas if we are having different approaches, we're ending up with something that maybe gives some people a privilege or advantage. Now, I'll give you an example of how far you can take this principle. In France, they had a socialist president at one time President Allende, who banned homework, and the kids rejoiced. But why did he ban homework? Well, because some families have parents that can help kids with homework. They'll get better grades, and this will help them along. And so according to the socialist egalitarian values of President Allende, this was obviously not okay. Clearly, if you go even further than a family helping a child with homework, what if the family is taking over that child's education? And as Andrew said, spending all their time with just one or two children. Is that fair? And I will allow any of you to respond to that as you wish.
I think you just answered the question. The answer to the question is you don't have equality now.
There's no way you can put one district against another and say that you've got equality there. It's going to be driven by family conditions. It's going to be driven by income. It's going to be driven by a lot of things. So I just think it's a false promise that could never have been delivered on. It was already in the answer to your own question. Okay.
Anybody else?
I've never thought that America was founded on principles of equality as much as it was founded on principles of opportunity. And I'm only saying this in strictly an educational sense. And I think that no matter what you do, even with the French president who banned homeschool, what's he going to do? Is he going to have someone go into their home? What?
Homework.
Homework. That's what I meant to say. What's he going to do? Have people go into their home and make sure that their parents aren't giving them pep talks about how to behave in school? I mean, literally the only way that you could possibly try to have equality in education would be to force students into dormitories, make them wear specific uniforms, and not allow them to see their families. Because if you're really focused on strict equality, you're going to have to get pretty controlling of the students.
I think you're talking about boarding school.
Hmm.
And when we look at it from that perspective, is there equality? I think when we look at it from that perspective, opportunity gives us equality.
Okay. I'm going to go to the audience for the next question. Yes.
For Professor Harris, as far as school funding, if we were not to do the lottery, then who do we decide who is funded? For example, which private schools would be funded, and how would we get the attraction to get more students to go to those private schools?
Well, we're being taxed anyway, so just make the tax where the tax is evenly distributed. But I think what we probably need to do is cut back on the amount of public schools and give people opportunities to have school.
Yes, sir.
Question for Andrew. I just don't have any knowledge, but is there any funding for homeschooling? I know that you said you were taking trips with your mom and things, but for families who don't have the money to fund those trips and all the other opportunities that traditional schooling gives, like, is there funding for it, or how would you go about that?
Yeah, so yeah, are you asking if there's government funding or if there's just any funding?
Both.
Okay. So yeah, to my knowledge, in America today, I do not believe we have any government funding that's like strictly supposed to help homeschoolers. There's a lot of talk about school vouchers and how that might help homeschoolers, almost give them a little bit of a scholarship to start affording their curriculums and such. But no, as of now, there's no government funding for that sort of thing. There's a lot of private groups in the private sector. Like here in Midland, a big thing is Chem Ministry. And so those private groups typically say that for an annual fee, you have access to many activities along with fellow non-traditional education students. And yeah, and so there is funding out there, and it's just not coming from the government right now.
So back in high school, I went to a place called Miles New Tech Entrepreneurial Academy, and it was a great experience, project-based learning. Classrooms were surrounded with, it was 2 teachers for 30 students instead of just the one, and they were teaching 2 subjects at a time, and they kind of intermingled them. One, for example, biology and art. So then we got to kind of do creative things with biology to structurally see what we were learning and everything. And it taught you a lot of skills about collaboration because you worked in groups every day and everything. You had to use technology. You got a laptop. Every student had a laptop. And I just thought it was an experience that I would never be the person I am today without it. And I wish to see it more in other schools. Now, for people who might not be aware of that, of those opportunities, because I find education to be a problem with just awareness, like what's out there, what opportunities are there. Now, is that something that the government has failed to do in showing people what the options are, or is that on the individual family to do, to go out and seek new opportunities for their own children or for themselves if they want to get education? I guess, what were you guys' thoughts on awareness of education and opportunity?
I'd say that in a lot of instances, it will fall back on the family. And I think that the institution should also be willing to help out those families in terms of making them informed what's available, what they can and can't do. I like the idea of the school that you came from, because I think that instead of students being turned off because it's just science, or students that are more science oriented being turned off because it's combining the two, pretty creative as far as I'm concerned.
I think, right, for years it was, I live in this neighborhood, so my kids go to this school. Then you introduced, if they didn't have to go to the neighborhood school, they could go to any school in the district. Then you expanded that outside the district. Then you expand that to basically a voucher system where you can use that voucher at a variety of different schools. The more options you add, the more that a choice has to be made, which necessitates parental involvement. And so my principle is the parents have the most direct emotional and financial relationship to the child, and so you put them in a position where they can and will choose, as opposed to just defaulting.
Next question. All right, I'm going to go ahead, Ben.
All right. So, do you think because we pay taxes to the public schools that's kind of like us putting skin into the game and like kind of forces us to send our kids to public schools rather than paying those taxes and sending them to a private school where you have to pay a certain amount of money?
Well, I don't know if it forces you to. There's a lot of talk about different things like how fair it is, and I don't really want to. I don't know if either of you could speak to more of how fair it is to pay taxes for public schools if you're not using them. But no, I wouldn't say that it's forcing you to, but it may incentivize some families to.
It also has to be where a family has the ability to afford to do it on top of the taxes.
Yeah, I think if the tax is going to be collected and it's going to be spent on education anyway, why not? I don't think it's going to be collected anyway. I would just give the ability to determine how it's spent to the parents. I mean, right, we homeschooled, so we had that expense on top of what we were already paying in taxes. What it kind of gives me is we all have skin in the game of making sure people are educated, right? And they're able to become happy, flourishing people, and they're able to be productive. So we're all sort of in that game anyway, whether we pay taxes into it or not. But I do have considerably more skin in the game as far as my own kids. Now, if you want to say,
I shouldn't get somebody else's skin. In other words, I shouldn't get someone else's tax dollars. We eventually reach a point where we just defund it through tax dollars and find other ways. We just treat it like other things in the market. You want it, you buy it. And if you can't afford it, you get somebody else to pay for it through some kind of philanthropy. You know, we could do that. I think that we do that with a lot of other things. I'm not sure why we don't do it with education, because it seems to work in so many other areas. And I don't know why those same principles that I talked about and the whole panel's talked about, I don't know why we couldn't just apply that to education as well.
So I'm assuming basically everyone in this room probably is in pretty much favor of like some form of like meritocracy, that you earn the position that you get into. I guess, would you consider a world with like just charter schools and private schools to be more of a meritocracy, despite probably the main thing deciding what schools to go to is the wealth and the influence of a family? To me, I don't know. I guess, like, do you think a world like that is more meritocratic than one that tries to give everyone an equal level of opportunity?
I'm not sure school constitutes an opportunity.
What do you mean?
School's overrated.
Yeah, that's true.
So insofar as school equals credential, credential equals qualified, I would, as I said, chip away at that as much as I could.
Just chip away at the mentality that schools actually merit anything.
Yeah, because you ultimately want to know what a person knows and what they can do. And both a formal education process and a credential may or may not indicate that that's the case. I could elaborate on that, but I'll let it. Go ahead.
Well, so you're asking if a world without public school would be more, yeah. I think that's I think probably, and I think that this whole idea of you kind of basically you're entering into a public school is kind of just because you have a pulse and you're under the age of 18, and so I guess there's not a lot of merit required to get into them. Now, I'm not saying that that's a good or a bad thing. I'm just saying that yeah, probably.
The other thing is, not all public schools are bad. It's just a lot of them that are. And so it's not working. And so what I'm basically saying to you is those that work, that's fine. But those that are not working, then, yeah, we probably do need to look at private and charter.
John?
Do you think that there should be more standards set for people studying education now that are going to be the teachers? And maybe the process that they're going through needs to be changed?
I would actually close schools of education. Schools of education didn't exist for a long time. If you wanted to teach something, you had to know the subject. So we created schools of education, and I'll just give you two examples. Right now, Hillsdale produces teachers, and so does Grove City. Grove City is more interested in producing teachers for public systems. Hillsdale's more interested in producing teachers for classical charter parochial schools. Grove City has a school of education, essentially, or department within. Hillsdale does not. Just like Hillsdale doesn't have a department of journalism, but they produce a lot of people that go into journalism. So the idea is you educate people and you let them teach or you let them write, as opposed to creating methodologies and pedagogies. And what's happening at Grove City is there's a lot more controversy over ideologies, in other words, politics, creeping into the college, because where it's creeping in is through the department that's handling supposedly teaching people how to educate. You don't have that happening at Hillsdale because the idea is just educate people and then let them go teach in places where they don't need a credential or a certificate that says they sat through so many classes in how to educate. They learn their subject. So that would be, I would just decertify the whole process and then let people stand or fall on their own merits.
Okay, we actually have come to the end of this session. It went by quickly, and I really appreciate the participation of all our panelists, and this is an important issue for our future, and thank you for enlightening us today.